Welcome to another episode of the NEI podcast. I am Dr. Sabrina Siegel, and we are at NEI Max 2020. It's our final day, and we are here with psychiatric nurse practitioner Deb York for an extended Q&A session. Let's listen in as she addresses your most pressing questions from today's presentation on early life childhood adversity.
Hello, everybody. We have just finished watching Deb York's presentation on early childhood adversity. Such a powerful talk, and I'm so excited to have her here with me today. We have a chance to answer some of your unanswered questions from her Q&A in this extended Q&A podcast. Welcome, Deb York.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Siegel. Thank you so much for having me. What an honor and privilege to be speaking this morning on early childhood adversity.
Yes, this is such an important topic. So our first question for you is, I know that you spoke many times on resiliency models in your talk and the importance of this. And while the talk also focused on some high-level epigenetics mechanisms, we really want to hone in on what can people do to help this population, right? If you were to summarize one of the tools for protecting children and adolescents in this age group, what would your biggest take-home be?
So several, actually. Building resilience is so important. Getting enough sleep, managing stress, thought awareness, cognitive restructuring, learning to accept mistakes and failures, and to go back and just create like a perspective of the situation. And then, of course, I say this, the 3 C's of resilience: competence, confidence, connection, character, contribution, coping, control. And then there's categories of resilience too. So we've got the psychological category, emotional, physical, and then, of course, community as well. It takes a village to raise children. And then there's 5 skills of resilience as well. So awareness, mindfulness training is super important. Cannot stress that enough. And of course, self-care is so important. Positive relationships, hanging out with people who make you feel good is really important in the early life childhood years as well as adolescent years, as we know. And then having life purpose, I think, is super strengthening of all of these pillars to become more resilient. And I think that a lot of times cognitive distortions or these exaggerations or irrational thought patterns get implanted in the cognitive processing of dealing with early childhood adversity. And so being able to overcome cognitive distortions, we all have cognitive distortions.
Yes.
And so to be involved in the dealing with those, laughing about the ones that you know that you do, and also being able to work through those, the ones that are more serious, and just really having that therapeutic conversation with somebody that you have trust with is so very important.
Right. And I love that you touched on that, especially the cognitive distortions, because I don't think there's enough attention and focus given to this. And we talk about how much by the time we're an adult, and cognitive behavioral therapy came up several times at this conference, and just how powerful that therapy can be. Sometimes when I stop to think about what if we were able to implement this at a much earlier age, and I think that there should be a shift and toward that focus, because how much more helpful could that be if we were able to stop these cognitive distortions at a much earlier age? And I think that when we are talking about this very vulnerable population, they're absolutely more susceptible to these cognitive distortions. So I'm so glad that you brought that point up.
Absolutely. And what exactly do cognitive distortions cause? They cause that increase in depression and anxiety because they're that thought that creates what potentially may be their reality. Involved in the onset or perpetuation of psychopathological states, you want to try and get that whole round table swirling down the toilet kind of thought process totally out of the current thought processing in young children, for sure.
Right, right. So another question that we received here is a question asking, is early life adversity the same thing as childhood trauma? And could these terms be used interchangeably, or are there differences between the two? Could you address this?
This is an interesting question, and I do believe that early childhood adversity includes trauma, right? So depending on what the adversity was, that is trauma. And if you look up adverse childhood experience and what is included in that, one of the things that I think is missing in that category is early childhood surgery. So potentially a congenital anomaly at birth, and a child has to have open heart surgery at a couple months old, and they're in the ICU for months on end and may have to have another surgery later on too as the child grows. So I think surgery is one that is missing out of the categories of adverse childhood experience for children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Absolutely.
I definitely think those are very paralleled terms, trauma and early childhood adversity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we have one more question here. Has there been a trend over time for a change in the average number of adverse childhood events that individuals have sustained? Have we maybe seen a trend or an increase in this? What would be your comment or your feedback on this, especially given the current situation and this year?
Yeah, Dr. Siegel, that's such a great point to bring up. So we know that as small children grow, looking at the mouth and being able to read social cues is so incredibly important. And this virus and pandemic has made a huge impact that I don't even think we have the research back yet. I'm sure it's being formulated for preschoolers to go to school and everybody's in masks, and it's such a foreign environment for them. And these are the times that they have parallel play together, and and they've got this incredible interaction and bond with their teacher, and they can't even see the words that are being formed by their teacher. So I think we're gonna see a little bit of a step back here with the young children who have experienced this in the preschool years and in the primary school age groups, and their social as well as their academic development not being able to have that social interaction, and seeing the mouth and being able to, it's amazing, even just myself, like going to order a coffee and it just seems like everything is mumbled, and it's amazing how you just really, I mean, you read lips so much when you see somebody's face and you see their expression, and when you just see their eyes and you don't see anything else, it's like, I'm sorry, what did you say? What? Coffee would you like? And so the importance of actually seeing the mouth and watching it move and being able to look at all of those social cues, I think is completely underestimated. And I've certainly taken a step back and realized the importance of that throughout this
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that, because I was actually talking about that with Dr. Sauvé in his podcast on the impact of COVID on mental health. And he was saying that he was just trying to buy meat at the grocery store, and he had completely misinterpreted the way that this person was interacting with him, and in a negative way. And it made him really angry until he stopped and really just honed in on the eyes to try to figure out where this person was coming from. And then you realize, oh, the person wasn't being disrespectful or rude in any way. And so I think you bring up such a good point in terms of just how this is affecting not just adults, but then especially our children. If at an early age they're trying to read facial expressions, understand them, learn them, and that's so important for their own emotional development, I think you really hit a key point here.
Yeah, I think it's something that we are, like I said, we have so much more to learn about it, and it may not come out for a couple years, and to be able to study those children during this time. And even though we don't have an end in sight quite with COVID, I think it's a special population and a vulnerable population in research that is needed for study without question.
Yeah. And now what can you say about, we've heard some reports about the increase in child abuse, and yet the numbers aren't totally reflecting that in terms of reports. What are your thoughts on that during this pandemic and what's really going on?
I think people are in a state of feeling hopeless. And what is the point of calling X, Y, and Z? This is the state of affairs that we're in. And so I think, I don't know if people really have a clear vision of what's available to them. And people are afraid more than anything. They're afraid to go out and seek abuse shelters, or they think that they're not available because of COVID. And I think those are great questions that people are certainly asking and involved with, related to not being able to seek out the appropriate care that they need in these situations. And it's scary. I think people are scared.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I think you're right. And what's really interesting is we have kind of the double whammy of that going on, and then also coupled with the fact that we have so many children distance learning and not learning physically at school. And for as long as we can remember, it's been the teachers who've reported whether or not they suspect some form of abuse going on with the child. And now that they're not in person, you think that could be one reason why maybe these reports aren't being made, even though we know that with the increased stressors at home, that child abuse has been more prevalent during this pandemic.
You know, I work with a lot of young children and adolescents, and my first question is, how's COVID season? That's what I call it. and they start laughing, and I'm like, so tell me what's going on this week. So what they're doing in Colorado is that if there is a COVID case that has been identified at a school, then the kids go back home for 14 days, and then things settle, and then they go back to school, or they do a different schedule where they're like 3 days on and 2 days off. And so everything's just kind of different around the country. And I think it almost builds excitement for them to go back to school. They all say, I learn better definitely when I'm at school. And I said, that's absolutely reasonable. And it's something to look forward to. So I always encourage the kiddos to look forward to going back to school on Thursday and Friday. And then kids are so resilient, and they've just really taken this in stride. And I do feel like there is a fear factor, and they are scared, but at the same time, they are going with the flow, and I have to give it to them. They're just really taking this on and being patient. And I think more than anything, the parents are the ones that are the most impatient, because we're not used to schooling. There's parents who have kids in different age groups, so they've got them in 3rd grade and 5th grade and 7th grade, and they're trying to help them with their homework and be the teacher. And I think the majority of the stress really is on the parents. And so when the parents are getting frustrated and don't understand the kiddos' homework, or if they've got bad internet connections and they're unable to connect in the virtual classrooms, I think those have been a lot of the frustrations that I've heard clinically with my patients throughout this. But they're troopers. They're trooping right along. And hopefully we will have an end to this within the very near future. And I look forward to being at NEI next fall. And
yes, in person,
and hopefully this will all be over. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you for being on our show today.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to these extended Q&A sessions from NEI Max 2020. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast so that you won't miss a single episode.